The concrete floor of the prison is very cold beneath his feet and has stayed that way for nearly 4 decades. His hair, once black, has now been reduced to brittle white strands, and those hands that once did the horrible violent acts you'll see in this video in the summer of 1985 now move with the stiffness of age, swollen joints, and arthritis setting in. He is 75 years old and has been waiting to die longer than an entire generation has lived. That man is Roger Dale Epperson. But the figure sitting inside Kentucky State Penitentiary today is not the one who arrived in 1986. That man carried strength in his frame and calculation in his eyes. He had time and energy to fight and scheme, but the years have carved all of that away. Now what remains is a hollowed figure that's detached from freedom itself. His world is made of concrete, steel, and routine. And through it all, one truth that has never moved is Roger Epperson's death sentence. The average death row inmate spends close to 22 years waiting for execution, and for Kentucky's inmates, it's a really long time. Imprisoned inside the fortress-like Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville, where more than 26 condemned men occupy 6-by-9-foot concrete boxes that function as tombs for the living, they live almost 20 hours of daily solitary confinement. But for Epperson, it's been nearly 40 years. He's witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall from his cell, watched the internet revolutionize human communication through prison television, lived through September 11th and the COVID-19 pandemic, all while his execution date remains permanently stamped pending in bureaucratic files that grow thicker with each passing year. But that doesn't seem like enough punishment fit for a man who has committed the type of violent, bizarre crimes he's in for. However, understanding how he became one of America's oldest death row inmates requires examining the blood-soaked crimes of summer 1985 in a small Kentucky town when a desperate man made decisions that would echo through 4 decades.
So you think about a guy that's 32 years old that's never lived more than a block away from his parents, walks in and finds them both brutally, savagely murdered. You could take a picture of him the day before and then a picture probably 2 weeks later and you never know it's the same person.
A small Kentucky town in 1985 operated on trust, which seems almost naive by modern standards. Greyhawk Jackson County represented the kind of community where neighbors protected each other and violent crime happened to other people in distant places. Edwin Morris, 65, would unlock his door for anyone claiming police authority, while his wife Bessie, 69, left windows open during summer nights. Roger Epperson had been conducting surveillance on their home for weeks, studying their routine with the methodical patience of a professional hunter. The 35-year-old criminal had absorbed local gossip about substantial cash reserves, reaching nearly $35,000. According to whispered rumors, the cash was hidden inside Edwin Morris's bedroom safe. What makes this pretty sad is that both parties seemed to know each other in the community and were probably friends. But the money, which was decades of honest labor, would prove irresistible to men who measured wealth by what they could steal from others. But Epperson understood that this particular target required experienced accomplices. Benny Lee Hodge brought a resume of armed robbery and assault charges, the kind of criminal who approached violence as a practical business tool. His other accomplice, Donald Terry Bartley, younger and more anxious than his partners, had agreed to function as lookout in exchange for a reduced share of the proceeds. However, none of them anticipated that their planned robbery would quickly change into something that would terrorize Kentucky communities for generations. June 16, 1985 was uneventful like countless Sundays inside the Morris home. Edwin kept to his work and Bessie to her household rhythm. By late evening, the couple had eaten, watched television, and gone to bed at 11 p.m. By 11:15, their lights were out. From the outside, nothing about that night suggested danger, but predictable schedules become death sentences when killers are taking notes. The house had settled into its usual calm. However, the calm ended at midnight. Their routine had not gone unnoticed. At exactly 12:15 a.m., Epperson and crew made their move, knocked on the door, and asked Ed if he could use his phone. Believing the call was legitimate, Edwin, in his pajamas, went to the front door. He had no reason to doubt the call, no reason to think danger was waiting on the other side. When he turned the handle, 2 men forced their way inside and both carried weapons. The couple was overpowered before they could process what was happening. The Morris home, quiet for decades, was turned upside down in minutes. And for nearly an hour, the home was no longer theirs as the robbers demanded money, jewelry, and anything of value.
Walks in and finds them both brutally, savagely murdered. You could take a picture of him the day before, and then a picture probably 2 weeks later, and you never know it's the same person. We ended up moving to another county, Madison County, which is a connecting county from there. But he was never the same, which affected my family. We'll go with that first. With my mother, she had to deal with a guy that was basically dead. I mean, he wanted to die. That's all you heard him talk about. I want to die. I don't want to be here.
Edwin's hands were tied behind his back, while cloth gagging silenced his attempts to plead for mercy. He tried to get the pistol on top of the refrigerator, but had failed. Bessie inside heard the scuffle and materialized in the hallway, clutching her nightrobe, only to be dragged through the hallway and receive identical restraints from men who regarded elderly victims as mere inconveniences, blocking their path to money. But even if they complied, it wouldn't have offered any protection from what followed. Edwin eventually gave up his safe combination at 12:45 a.m. Inside was $35,000 in accumulated bills, plus jewelry, including diamond rings and earrings that chronicled decades of anniversary celebrations and special occasions. Everything the Morris couple had constructed together vanished into canvas bags within minutes of revelation. But robbery was only half the plan. Years later, Bartley's subsequent testimony delivered in exchange for immunity from execution revealed that Epperson had initially never intended to leave any witnesses. The killers armed themselves with a .38 revolver and a 9mm pistol, and in disturbing detail, pulled pillows from the marital bed and pressed them against the barrels to act as silencers. Investigators later described this as deliberate preparation for execution, which would later contribute to the severity of their sentences. At 1:07 a.m., Edwin Morris was shot twice in the head while still bound and gagged on his bedroom floor. He had lived through multiple heart attacks, strokes, and even cancer, walking with a cane but still alive against the odds. A man who'd harmed no one during 75 years of existence, executed like livestock while his wife absorbed every horrifying detail from 3 feet away. But Bessie, too, would not survive to tell the tale. 12 seconds of absolute silence elapsed before the killers redirected their attention to her, who had begun whispering prayers that perhaps divine intervention might preserve her life. Bessie, too, had endured her own health battles, including the surgical loss of an eye. She begged the intruders to take anything and spare them. But she was forced to watch her husband's murder, then later dragged to the back of the house and assaulted. At 1:08 a.m., she was shot twice on her back while attempting to crawl toward her husband's corpse, dying on the carpet where she'd knelt for morning prayers throughout 4 decades of marriage. The house settled into deathly quiet, broken only by sounds of systematic looting as 2 men stepped over cooling bodies to complete their theft. Forensic investigators would later discover gunshot residue embedded in those pillows, confirming that both victims had suffered point-blank executions with deliberate precision.
At the time, we didn't know that. So it was a lot of finger-pointing, questioning. It did bring all of us closer.
Good.
If that's possible, because we had a common enemy, a common bond. We knew what everybody was going through, so it was hard. You had to lean on each other a little bit more.
But the blood money carried an expiration date of exactly 8 weeks, because by early August 1985, greed had regenerated in the hearts of the men that viewed murder as a renewable income source, and Roger Epperson was already orchestrating his next score. This time, it was big fish. Dr. Roscoe Acker embodied everything Epperson coveted: professional success, community respect, and most crucially, substantial cash reserves that local speculation had inflated to nearly $2 million in his fevered imagination. But this time, the killers decided they would need a more sophisticated approach. The rain had stopped by evening on August 8, 1985, leaving the air thick and humid across the Kentucky hills. At 9 or 10:30 p.m., 2 figures came out from a stolen car parked at the end of Dr. Acker's driveway. They were joined later by a third man. The three of them had traded their usual work clothes for dark, ill-fitting suits purchased from a second-hand shop not too far away. The polyester fabric clung uncomfortably to their bodies in the August heat, but the professional appearance seemed to serve its purpose. Each man carried forged FBI credentials that would fool no federal agent, but might convince a rural doctor who rarely encountered law enforcement. The doctor answered with the same trusting nature that had made him beloved in the community. Because when three serious-looking men in suits flashed federal badges asking about former associates, for some, it would seem entirely plausible, especially since it involved Eastern Kentucky, which had become somewhat a corridor for narcotics. He asked them to come in and offered them coffee. His daughter, Tammy, had just put on a fresh pot a few minutes before. The killers accepted his hospitality and settled in the living room. Tammy came from the kitchen with a tray of coffee and cream. She was 23 years old, a student who had recently moved back home to help care for her aging father after her mother died. Her athletic build came from years of tennis and swimming, activities that had given her both strength and reflexes that would soon matter more than she could imagine. For the next 4 minutes, Epperson, who had appointed himself the leader of this particular deception, asked carefully rehearsed, unsuspecting questions about work and the usual happenings and whether Dr. Acker had noticed any increase in drug-related medical emergencies. This seemed normal and most likely threw off suspicion. However, 4 minutes later, Epperson's badge disappeared into his jacket pocket as his other hand produced a .38 revolver, the same he used for the Morrises. Hodge and Bartley followed suit, pulling out their own weapons. Both father and daughter were startled at the scene before them as Epperson started making his threats and forced him to tell them where the safe was. According to him, they knew he kept cash there and had to tell them so nobody had to get hurt. But the killers had already decided that someone would get hurt. They had learned from the Morris murders that leaving witnesses alive created complications, and their binding techniques reflected this knowledge. Using rope they had brought specifically for this purpose, they physically assaulted and tied Dr. Acker to his favorite armchair very tight, so tight that he was starting to turn white from poor circulation. Then they choked him with a cord till he was unconscious and left him, thinking he was dead. The safe was behind a painting in Dr. Acker's study, and inside, bundles of cash, mostly hundreds and fifties, neatly organized and bound with rubber bands. It was money saved for his retirement and Tammy's future. They had tied the daughter the same way, but the men had underestimated both her desperation and her physical capabilities, because while they ransacked the house searching for the safe, she got loose. A minute later, she was free from her restraints and tried to escape from the kitchen, but Hodge had been watching for exactly this kind of attempt. He caught her and tackled her with enough force to drive the breath from her lungs and send them both crashing into the coffee table. Instead of simply restraining her, he stabbed her multiple times with a kitchen knife. The first stab wound pierced her abdomen just below the rib cage. It should have been fatal, or at least incapacitating. But Hodge continued 12 times, and her blood soaked into the carpet. Tammy Acker died at 10:52 p.m., while her killer wiped blood from his blade with one of her mother's dish towels. The entire murder had taken 11 minutes longer than planned. The three men emptied Dr. Acker's safe of substantial cash before fleeing the scene. When he was conscious minutes later, he tried setting himself loose and then saw his daughter lifeless on the floor. In their execution of the crime, the killers made a mistake by leaving the doctor alive. Despite the beating and strangulation attempt, the 78-year-old physician survived as a witness to identify his attackers. This surviving witness would prove crucial to their eventual capture and conviction, but the case would not be resolved quickly. It would take nearly 3 months for justice to catch up with them. The investigation that followed consumed every available resource in eastern Kentucky, with state police working around the clock to solve what appeared to be connected crimes. Ballistics experts matched evidence from both the Morris and Acker crime scenes, confirming that the same weapons had been used in multiple murders. The three men were later found arrested on August 15, 1985, in a Miami motel room where they had been loudly living off their victims' money while planning additional crimes. When handcuffs clicked around their wrists, they were still counting cash that belonged to dead people. But their legal issues were just beginning. They were brought back to Kentucky to stand trial, and the breakthrough came from an unexpected confession. Bartley chose to cooperate with prosecutors by providing investigators with a complete account of both killing sprees. His testimony revealed names, dates, locations, and methods that only someone present during the crimes could possibly know. From the witness stand, he laid out in detail how both Hodge and Epperson took leading roles in the robbery and killing. The trial court allowed jurors to hear statements connected to Hodge even though he never testified in person. But one of the most damaging pieces of evidence came from inside a Florida jail. While locked up, Hodge had opened up to another inmate, Lawrence Smith, and admitted his involvement in the Acker break-in and murder. The message was clear that Hodge too had confessed, and the jury was left to connect the dots.
And talking to you, Mark, down at the restaurant down there at the marina, which is some of the best food you have in the county, but and how you dropped that on us, and I was like, wow. And you know, that's that small world we live in where you just don't know when you meet people what struggles they've been through, what their families have been through. So welcome. We're really excited about it.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, I think it's an important story to tell from front to back.
1987 for the Acker murders, with both defendants receiving death sentences that seemed to ensure swift justice for their victims' families. However, Bartley's sentence was reduced from the death penalty to life without parole for at least 25 years and 99 months in prison when he testified that Epperson was the mastermind behind everything. Epperson had already received his first death sentence for the Morris murders, but that conviction was somehow vacated because the trial court failed to conduct individual voir dire regarding pretrial publicity. The Kentucky legal system had become entangled in its own procedural requirements, creating delays that would stretch far beyond anyone's expectations. This time, prosecutors focused on complicity charges rather than attempting to prove that Epperson personally fired the fatal shots. He was retried in 1996, and again the jury convicted him of complicity to commit capital murder, armed robbery, and burglary, both of first degree. Under Kentucky law, these charges qualified as statutory aggravators supporting a death sentence, even though Epperson may not have personally pulled the trigger that ended Edwin and Bessie Morris's lives. However, Epperson's legal team still continued filing post-conviction motions, each one delaying his execution while he aged in his cell. And by the late 2010s, the Acker case was still haunting Kentucky's courts. Their arguments ranged from claims of jury bias to accusations that his original trial lawyer, Lester Burns, had given him sort of an inadequate defense, also due to the fact that the lawyer too had also been convicted of conspiracy, mail fraud, and transporting stolen money across state lines, for which he got 11 years behind bars. Every time the case cycled through the courts, the paperwork stacked higher and the bill for taxpayers got heavier. If nothing changed, this process could stretch on for decades. Some projections suggested Epperson could still be litigating the Acker death sentence well into his 80s. At that point, both sides, the prosecution and the defense and the Acker family, who had endured more than 30 years of court hearings and legal reruns, wanted closure. The state also wanted to stop burning money on endless appeals, and Epperson's attorneys wanted their client off death row, at least in one case. So they struck a deal, and the understanding was simple. If he dropped his appeal of the conviction itself, the state would agree to set aside the sentence. This meant no more retrials, and a guarantee that Epperson would live out a life sentence for the Acker killing. So in November 2019, almost 33 years since his first conviction, his death sentence for the Acker murders was commuted to life without parole as part of resolving his ongoing appeals. But it wasn't freedom for him, not even close. Because while the Acker death sentence disappeared, his place on Kentucky's death row didn't change because he still remained on it for the Morris killings. Currently, it's been nearly 40 years for Roger Dale Epperson after committing the crimes that brought him there. He has outlived some of the prosecutors who sought his death and become a living monument to the failure of swift justice in America. Edwin and Bessie Morris have been dead for nearly 4 decades, their killer aging in his cell while they remain forever frozen. Tammy Acker would have been 63 years old today, possibly watching grandchildren grow up and start families of their own. Instead, they exist only in yellowing crime scene photographs and the fading memories of people who loved them. Sometimes, one often wonders if justice was ever really served. If you want to see more chilling videos like this, like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.